Welcome to Studio Wesley Annex, the audiovisual podcast where we break down the lectionary text of the week. I'm going to keep going. My name's Sam Stoss Williams, and welcome to this episode where I've already started stuttering, which means it's going to be a great one today. Today, I'm joined with some lovely people, starting with Sydney. How's it going?
It's good, Sam. Thanks for asking.
Yeah. Grace, how you doing?
I'm well. Sid knows this information, but the two of y'all don't. As of by the time this episode airs, I will be student council vice president.
Oh wow!
Yeah, did not plan for it to happen, and there's a whole bunch. It's a long story that we don't have time for, but I'm well. Also,
That's
Sam,
awesome.
I grew up with a chronic stutter. We just breezed past it. We just breezed past it. You just keep talking, and look, we're already so far into the episode.
Mm-hmm. And nobody will be the wiser. You won't even be able to tell.
Yeah.
Allison, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. I've got power again post-hurricane, and that's all I needed to be good again. Also, Grace, you're all of the Madam VP posts I've seen now make so much more sense with that bit of information. I thought people were just Grace is phenomenal, because I was like, Grace is phenomenal, and they're just doing the thing, but there's actually a real reason too behind it.
Wasn't going to disagree with the Grace is phenomenal part, but now there's context.
Yeah.
Allison, do you want to keep going and hit us with our opening prayer?
Can do. God, I want to thank you for this time together as we continue to delve into these texts, learn from them, understand them, see how they apply to our lives, to our world today. I thank you for this time together and ask for your guidance as we do all of those things. In your name we pray, amen.
Amen. A little bit of added context for those of you watching. We decided to do this layout. We're trying it out where we can see everybody's faces. And as soon as the prayer started, I realized, I'm touching my face. Everybody can see that now. So you're going to get a whole new view of this today. To
be fair, Sam, we've always had the prayer whole screened like this still.
You've always been able to see that?
Yeah, we've never single screened the prayer before.
I don't know why I've never thought about it. Well, my eyes are closed, so I guess I want a super cut. Mike institute a super cut of all the times where I haven't been paying attention in a prayer. But we're gonna keep this show on the road. Sydney, you ready to take us away with your New Testament text?
Sure, let's do it. It's actually so nice that I don't have to just stare at my face while I talk. I can actually just talk to you guys, your faces, which I like. So I had Hebrews 7:23 through 28. And I'm going to be bringing a very raw interpretation today. Sure, there's much more. I say this every time. Sometimes I feel like when I'm doing these episodes, I'm not bringing, I guess, a very theological lens. I think I usually bring more of a socio-political lens to scriptures, just because I feel like that's more my expertise in general. I mean, I studied sociology and et cetera, et cetera. So I feel like I always have to give that disclaimer, because I'm always I'm sure there's much more better expertise on the theology of this text and the context and this, that, and the other. But I'm just going to give you some thoughts I had. So this text is about kind of contrasting Jesus to priests, right? Now there have been many of those priests since death prevented them from continuing in office, but because Jesus lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood. So it's talking about kind of law versus the new covenant, the new oath that came when Jesus died and was resurrected and sacrificed himself for our sins, etc. And I want to focus mostly on the last few verses that I'm just going to read. Such a high priest truly meets our need, one who is holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, exalted above the heavens. Unlike the other high priests, he does not need to offer sacrifices day after day, first for his own sins and then for the sins of the people. He sacrificed for their sins once for all when he offered himself. For the law, this one specifically, for the law appoints as high priests men in all their weakness. But the oath which came after the law appointed the Son who has been made perfect forever. I've been sitting with this thought about law versus like an oath and like what it means to exist in an imperfect world where like we need law, but we're also like striving for like the liberation that Jesus gives us, right? Because like Jesus is perfect and Jesus is like who we're striving to be like. And I was kind of wrestling with this idea, and I think generally this is like a very common thing that we wrestle with politically a lot, right? Like, what do we need laws for? Like what do we need laws? What do we need them for? Who do we need laws to protect? When are laws outdated? When do laws need to be changed? I'm just kind of like thinking about law in general, and also probably have law in the brain because the election is coming for all of us, and just the cloud over everything. But I guess something that came up for me was just the idea that like in our personal spirituality, what it looks like to both strive for this liberation and also acknowledge that we need structure and boundaries and we need law, and not necessarily law that is fixed and unchangeable and law that is top down and oppressive, but like what is our relationship to structure in our spiritual life? And because we are imperfect, right? And I think that too, like, I don't see it as like the law appoints high priests as high priests men in all their weakness. I don't necessarily think that's bad, actually. I think that we're humans and we have weaknesses. And so how do we, in navigating our own spiritual journey, like, because I think from my perspective, spirituality and religious practice is so personal. And it's something that on the last episode I was talking a lot about like discernment. And it's something so like, I don't think I don't think things apply to everyone universally, and I guess that's the thing I'm sitting with is like, I don't think spiritual law, religious law necessarily applies to everyone the same. And so, yeah, I guess like that's my takeaway is like sitting with myself and thinking about like, in what ways does my spiritual practice need structure and law, and what ways do I feel that I can really lean into just like the freedom and liberation that Jesus has provided us? In what ways do those things work together? So I have no really answer, but that's just what I'm thinking about.
No, I'm so glad that you brought that up, Sid, because like, I mean, that was my note as well. So I'm glad we're like on the same page. Yeah, thinking about like law versus oath, especially in the United Methodist Church, because like the running joke in general Methodist spaces, the running joke in theology school among Methodists or like between like different denominations is like the Methodists with the rules, and like even like the name like Methodist, if I remember correctly, was like kind of making fun of the fact that we had such an order to our like being. And it was like, you know what? You're right. I like how Methodist sounds. I could be wrong with that memory, but I think that that is how it happened. And thinking about like this the spirit of the law, or like the intent of the law, versus like the logistics of it. It made me think a lot about like our most recent general conference, and I did like a whole paper on this, so it's why like I'm quick to talk about it. But like some of the newer legislation that we have, we end up with like this like rule or this like social principle or something that like the spirit of it is awesome. And because like it's so easy to get nitpicky about the law, there's verbiage that needs to change to like kind of like tighten it up. Which, contact me later, we can get more into it, because it's like a whole conversation. I feel like every annex I'm on is just like, come talk to me later about this thing. So who knows what the next episode will hold, but like kind of thinking about this like spirit of the law, and like kind of having that transition from like hardcore or like rigid like law, yeah, see me after class, or I'm just thinking now like all of my professors who are like, Grace, can I see you for a minute? And like you already know in your head like what's like what missing work you have or something like that. See me after class for a good reason. I say all that to say, yeah, it makes me think about like, yeah, the word of the oath, which came later. Than the law appoints a son who has been made perfect forever. That's the NRSV translation, that like very last verse. But yeah, like law can be good, and like order and structure can be good. And it's so frustrating when it's so like nitpicky as well, which like we're so good at nitpicking the law. And like I am that person who like when you're sitting down to play board games, like I keep the rule book on me, and I will find my loopholes, and I will make it everyone's problem. So like I'm part of that. But like we're just really good at picking apart the like logistics of law, when like when we look at the oath and the like the direction that you took it, Sid, of like how can the law be good, I think is a really hard thing to reconcile. Because like when the law, some random like anonymous law, or like any given law in society, like it's really hard to reconcile when like the law can be good and like the law is so harmful as well. So like I'm glad that you, every time, Sid, you're like, I'm gonna say something controversial, and then all of us are like, no, thank you so much for saying that. So yeah, that's all I have, is just like, you're so right.
Yeah, it's interesting because like when you started, it started to pick my social work brain, which like makes sense. And because I think like with social work in general, and a lot of like helping fields, there's that aspect of like, yeah, there are laws, but like sometimes you have to blur the lines a little bit because different people need different things, and sometimes that involves a little bit of like blurring the lines. And so it like it started picking my social work brain, and then you connected it to like that spirituality aspect of it, and laws and oaths. And I think it's just so interesting to think about like so specifically for myself, like people will find out that I like work in ministry, I'm connected to ministries and things like that, and they're like, but what are you? And they're like wanting to know my denomination, and I'm like, the ministry I work for is Florida United Methodist Church. But I'm like, what am I? ? Because I feel like it's so hard to like flat out just be like, this is exactly what I'm doing in this denomination and this exact thing right here. When I'm like, no, my spirituality is just kind of here. And so I think it's interesting to talk about like oaths and laws in connection to your spirituality, because like in my brain, especially for me, what it's like to have faith, when it's like to explore ministry in the way that I do, it's like I don't feel like there's one box that I fit into. And so because of that, I think there's like different laws, different oaths, different rules. I don't really like the word rules, but things that come out of the fact that I don't feel like there's one box that I fit into. And so I just think it's a really interesting, like, I don't know, it's just a really interesting conversation of like what defines it. And you know, there's also just so many things that feel so silly when you read the text that you're like, that's such a silly little thing that you say that I can't do, and why can't I do it? Like, what's the why? Where's your backup for it? What am I actually harming in this situation? And so I don't know. I just think it's a really interesting conversation, I think. Yeah.
I want to begin by kind of echoing something Grace said by saying, Sid, you should never apologize for coming on here and not bringing your religious take and bringing your own take to it. Especially you said like a socio-political take. I'm a poli-sci student at a place called American University. I'm not coming here with a religious take. I like 9 times out of 10, that's not where my brain's going. But having said that, it's interesting that you set up with that. And then all 3 of you guys talked about this text in a personal way. I never would have gotten that. And like, as I was hearing it, I was like, that's really interesting. Because on the personal side, what I was thinking about is I'm reading a biography right now by somebody that like in history that I really look up to, and he's a Unitarian, and he talks about a lot how his faith inspired him. And I didn't know anything about Unitarianism, and I was reading about it, and I don't like rules, but Unitarianism has no rules, to the point where I'm like, I don't like rules, but that's a lot of less rules. Like that is, you know? And so like, it made me really like proud of the faith that I'm in, because as much as I say that I don't like rules, there's a certain level of structure that I kind of need, especially in religion. So that's my personal thing. But when you were explaining that second half, was not thinking you were going to take it to the personal, because I immediately started thinking about the institutional. Because what does a structure that's based off of the oath and not the law look like? What does an institution of laws look like when it's based off the oath? And like, would we be able to see that? And you thought you were going to say the controversial thing. I'm going to say it, and I'm kind of afraid to say it because it's going to get clipped out of context by somebody. But like, the idea of a world where we care for our neighbor and like only think we feel the pain that everybody else feels and all are equal, is the idea of like a species being that Marx talks about. And I don't agree with like Marxism, but like like if we're going to actually look at philosophy and we're going to look at institutions, let's look at institutions and not just like, what would that actually look like? And I think there's no way for us to see that. I think there's no institutions that we have that actually reflect that oath. And I think that's really interesting and something that I really like thinking about, especially when we talk about how laws should be written specifically and enforced. Like, how do we create laws that try to more reflect a world that we don't have, and that's based off of more of your own personal oath and conviction? So that was what my brain went to about like what you were talking about.
Can I chime back in?
Please.
Okay, so I think that's something that I was also trying to get at, is this idea that like law is like a tool to get us somewhere. Mm-hmm. And the somewhere that we want to go is not having the law. Oh, you know what I mean? Like, that's the somewhere I at least want to be, is to be so rooted in the oath that you don't really need, you don't need law. And not necessarily we get to do that in our lifetime, but when things are made to perfection, do you know what I'm saying? And we're all wholly rooted in the resurrection, in the oath, the law is a tool to get us there. And so I think that
earth is as it is in heaven.
Yeah. And so I think through the Marxist lens, which I'm not afraid to talk about Marx. Y'all know that's my boy. But you know, like the idea that which actually, if you think about it, that's a perfect example too, Sam, because communism, which, you know, whatever, I'm just going to get like socio-political really quick. Communism is a political theory where there's no money. It's a stateless, moneyless society. Okay. So no government. But a lot of people think, when they think of communism, they think of particular governments that have existed in history, whether it be dictatorships or like governments that have tried more socialist policy and and people always mix that up with the theory of communism. The theory of communism is just that. It's a theory. It's never actually existed, because it's a utopian society. It's an idea, and it's something that Marx was like dreaming of, like what political steps would we need to take to get to this utopia. He's a utopian. And so anyways, yeah, like, is that not kind of what we do sometimes when we talk about the kingdom of heaven? Is that not a utopian society? You know what I mean? And so, like, what if we both balanced imagination and hope, and also, okay, but like, what do we need right now? What tools do we need right now to get us there? What do I need for myself? What do we need in our structures so that, we're taking these baby steps to be at this place? I don't know. But yeah, I think it's like it all goes together.
So never apologize for a take like that. And never apologize for bringing your socio-political lens, because I think we all need a blend of like perspectives on this podcast, and that was awesome. That was great. I have no other words for it. Grace, do you want to keep us going and take us to the Old Testament text?
I would love to. So my Old Testament text is Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 7 through 9. And because it's just 3 verses, I wanted to like read them for y'all. Also, I'm going to try to pull up my Old Testament notes. If my camera bloops out for a second, just like pretend I'm still here. Just like pretend that I'm still here. All right. So when we look at Jeremiah, which also on our board today, my friends, we have Jeremiah was a bullfrog, was a good friend of mine, is our Old Testament text. Further below, we have that's a lot of less rules, a quote by Sam Styles Williams. For our listeners, for our non-visual listeners, this is just another reason why you should absolutely just like tune in to the video pod. But when we look at Jeremiah 31, specifically verses 7 through 9, I'm reading the NRSV UE for this, but for thus says the Lord, sing aloud with gladness for Jacob, and raise shouts for the chief of the nations. Proclaim, give praise, and say, save, O Lord, your people, the remnant of Israel. See, I am going to bring them from the land of the north and gather them from the farthest parts of the earth, among them the blind and the lame, those with child and those in labor together, a great company. They shall return here. With weeping they shall come, and with consolations I will lead them back. I will let them walk by brooks of water, in a straight path where they shall not stumble. For I have become a father to Israel, and Ephraim is my firstborn. So when I started thinking about this text, I was like, oh, I didn't really connect with Jeremiah when we were learning about it in Old Testament. So also partly I was like, okay, like, I hear you. Like, here's my chance to reconnect with this. There's this really interesting cycle that we see in the Old Testament where like folks are kind of like back and forth of like they get a king that does a great job and then a king that does a really awful job. And so then the like successors, like in my mind, it's comparable to if somebody is raised like super Republican. And so then they end up becoming like super Democratic because they were raised super Republican. But then because they're super Democratic, they raise their kids super Democratic. Those kids are like, they end up being super Republican. And so like you have that like shift. That's an example. That's not like this thing always happens. That's not what I'm saying. But it's interesting to see like it's just interesting to see that here in Jeremiah, and especially thinking about like kind of reconciling Sid's text from Hebrews and thinking about all of that. Like we're kind of seeing this like reformation of, or I want to say reformation. I know that like there's reformation, but you have this like reorganization of the law or of like the promise. I don't know why my camera is so excited right now. it's on center stage. And I guess like when I started talking about God's promise, it was like, oh my God. So do with that what you will. But yeah, like talking about how like it's gonna be a really tough time. And the people are like asking to be saved. And yeah, with weeping they shall come, with consolations I will lead them back. I will let them walk by brooks of water in a straight path where they shall not stumble. Because there's a lot of stumbling in the Old Testament. There's so much stumbling. And people are trying and they mess up. And then they do really great for a while. And then they continually mess up. And then there's all this like, I mean, life is very back and forth as well. So it makes sense that like any given group of people will be very back and forth and like struggle and then succeed and then arguably fail and then arguably like succeed again. Like that's very human. And so kind of thinking about this like oath and this like organization of like how do we want to be as humanity and how is God like leading us into that. I got a commentary because I'm in the library and I didn't even utilize that, but I'm thinking about like building on the Hebrews text and thinking about this like long-term development of the Israelites and having this like they're trying really hard and they mess up. And like Jeremiah, like having hit like we don't know a lot about Jeremiah as a person. But he is like portrayed kind of differently, which is interesting. One of my notes, and I don't remember the context for this, but I think it's very applicable here. It's saying like to announce disaster to deaf ears. And so it's just making me kind of think about like in Jeremiah, there is all of this like back and forth. And life is very back and forth. And when we think about this like law versus oath back and forth of like, are we like headed for doom? Are we like back on track? Are we doing all of these things? And having this like really firm like theme of like this is what you have to do versus this like openness and this like ability of like having the human experience. I said a lot of words, but I'm hoping that it makes sense to y'all. I just think like I don't know. I just think this is a great example in the Old Testament of like groups of people are really going to struggle. And sometimes they really get it wrong and sometimes they really do get it right. And like when we look into like this oath that we're committing ourselves to and this like structure of like growing together as people, like that is where we ought to aim. Not necessarily to like follow the law, like word for word follow the law. And I know that like in that time following the law was really important because they were being really chaotic and God was like, okay, like here's some really rigid straightforward laws because we need to just like reset. Yeah.
I think that like I don't know how much more I have to add to what you were saying, but something you had said at the end just like sparked a thought in my head. When I was reading this text earlier, the first thing that like kind of stood out to me, looking at my second screen over here, was the part where it's talking about like gathering all the people, and then it's like specifying where it's like, among them will be the blind and the disabled, expectant mothers and those in labor, and it like names different like demographics of people, and so at the end you were talking about like that human experience. So the phrase human experience, and it like sparked my brain for a second because I do work with autistic adults, and so my brain always like strays to this place of like, I think it's so fascinating when people name specifically, we're going to also collect people who are disabled. I'm like, that's so cool, but like it has that like in my brain, it's like that background of like, were you not going to otherwise? Like it's just such like a weird little thing in my head where I'm like, I love that you're doing that, But like, if we're getting all people, gathering all people, I don't know. It's just interesting. It's completely straying from what you were talking about, but that was where my brain like stuck to earlier. And then you said human experience, and I started thinking about like, you know, lived experience of those with disabilities and the fights to be included and all the things. And my brain went there.
Allison, that was interesting, but also you're completely fine. I'm also going to go very off script because I also took something else from this, because you were talking about like the back and forth and the people messing up. And something that I hear like all the time is people who look at Old Testament texts of people messing up and them being like, well, it was so easy. Why didn't they just follow the instructions? And I'm tired of this narrative. And so I like, especially when you're talking about it, like, you did such a beautiful job breaking down like the different like rulers at the time and how it went back and forth. And I'm just going to say, especially right now in election time, powerless citizens should be allowed to complain. And like, it's different now, but no, it's not. And so I think especially in this context where like there is no power for people if you are not a king, like there's no way to really have social status in like a large scale political realm. Like there's nothing you can do. And so I think when we look at these texts, seeing one, the humanity, like you said, of people messing up and of people stumbling, but also of these people who are watching these rulers make decisions. And at that time, having not only no power to change it, but also no knowledge for the most part of what's really going on and the decisions that are being made that impact them. And a wise person who may be on this episode once talked about Psalms and why these Psalms are good because they're the voice of the people and like allowing them to like vent. And so I just want to name that part of like, when we're looking at Old Testament texts, one, it is human to mess up, but also it is human to be upset when you have no power. And we don't give people enough credit for that. And we try to put those people down, especially in the Old Testament texts. So I think it's important to name. Sid, I feel like I just like teed you up for that one. I feel like I know where you're going with that.
Yeah, no, you absolutely did. I'm thinking a lot about like, just like community building, kind of to tie what you said, Grace, and what you said, Sam, what you said, Allison, is this idea of like what it means to be in community with people and I'm not just talking like, oh, we live in the same neighborhood, oh, we go to the same church. I'm talking about like the real community building that we're like not taught how to do here in America because we're so hyper individualistic, so meritocracy, whatever, like we're so focused on like the nuclear family, like we're so isolated from one another. And then, I'm on the internet, I'm sure y'all are on the internet. I love internet discourse, I'll admit it. But I get on the internet and I see people who have similar political ideas to me get on the internet tearing each other apart because they said the wrong thing. They did this bad thing. This group of people so problematic. Absolutely like, and I'm like, y'all, is this not what we do when we're trying to build community? Like we learn from each other. We make mistakes. We take care of each other. We go through seasons of mourning and seasons of celebration. And it's like we sometimes I guess I grieve how isolated we are from each other, especially in the age of like media and the internet. That like I feel like we're really having to relearn what it means to like be in community and be committed to a community of people and see them through, even when we get way off track, because Lord knows whole communities of people will get off track, right? And that doesn't mean that you abandon your community. That means that you have to be a prophetic voice in that community. You have to be like, hey, y'all, we are off the rail right now, right? And so it's just kind of like, I think about that a lot. And I think about what it means to love in community and how it's not about trying to dwindle your community down to the perfect people. It's about like being as wide and generous as you can and learning how to do conflict resolution, right? Learning how to call each other out in love. I don't know. So I feel like I I think about that a lot. And I agree. I love the old. I don't always love it because sometimes the stories are really tragic. But in the Old Testament, just seeing these examples of like, this is what happens when a group of people are really trying to follow God and they're really misled, and they're really confused and they're oppressed, like they're literally materially oppressed. They make bad decisions sometimes.
Yeah. I love this. I love this discussion. And especially, I mean, it's once again like building off of what all of us have been saying, and specifically like this last round of discussion of having like all people involved and not just like yeah, we'll take the disabled ones too. I say that as a disabled person. Like, it's not just like, yeah, we'll take those guys too. Why not? We're good people. We'll take the disabled folks. Like, but having this like community together and this like beloved community, if you will, life together, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Oh my gosh, Bonhoeffer. What a life. So having that group together and then having like this back and forth. Something that we also discussed last year was just talking about like how Jeremiah, it's arguable whether or not they're in chronological order. So like the scholar that we were hearing from, it's like many of the texts are not in chronological order, and that could allude to having like a trauma response and like a jumbled memory from like all of these like difficult times. And like, if the people are oppressed, like, yeah, it is going to be traumatizing. And so having this like not just a back and forth of like having lived experience. That was a lived experience right there. But that'll preach. Having this lived experience overall and having the Israelites like living through this like back and forth, but having like even just the Jeremiah text being so back and forth and like not in chronological order and confusing, and like it's reflective of the times that people are living in. And like, again, like it makes sense that people are gonna like be upset and that people are gonna end up with like these like chaotic actions because they have existed in a chaotic structure. And so like falling back to like, how do we maintain like community with each other out of like love and out of connection rather than just like, what does the law tell you to do? That's all that I wanted to add. But
And as we're transitioning to break, like everybody has said it, but it cannot be said enough. None of us are saying we have to agree with people to be in community. Nobody's saying that we all have to have the same opinion to be a community. I think, Sydney, you articulated it best of like, we have to have a way to disagree with each other correctly, which we don't anymore. We've completely lost that respectful debate and that conversation-based growth. We've lost that, but we're not saying that to be in the beloved community, you have to agree with me. And so I like want to leave, especially if we're going to break, like the audience, like think about what that actually means and think about the people in your life and some of the people who have a yard sign that you don't disagree with. What does that actually look like in today's day and age to do that? So with that, I'm going to leave it on that one and send it to break. So yeah, enjoy that one. We are back. I hope that my transition to break last time wasn't too serious because we do have two more, and I know it's going to probably get harder because that's just how these episodes go. We get real here. So, Allison, do you want to take us away with Psalm 34?
I sure do. That was me trying to go into this with confidence. I read this thing like 1,000 times, and I had a really hard time pulling from it today. I shouldn't have said today as if I, didn't plan for this right before we started recording. But it's just so interesting. I think when I read Psalms, I always go negative. Like I don't think it matters the psalm. My brain just instantly starts like like going to that like negative point. And so I'm reading through this psalm, and like literally it's like verse. Oh, I should tell you what it is. Psalm 34, 1-8. Hello. Literally verse 5 says, "Those who look to God will shine. Their faces are never ashamed." And my immediate reaction was like, I can still feel shame and look to God. Like I literally like went to that negative, like, this is such a silly thing for you to say. And I did that like a few times throughout it. Because sometimes it's just interesting to me to like that thought process of like, I don't know, it brings my brain to like all those cliches of like something horrible is happening in your life and people's like, God will fix it or God will save it. And I'm like, someone being sick or having an illness or something, like it's a thing that's happening, and it just feels, and so that's where my brain initially like went with this text. It started going down that negative path of like all those things. So I tried really hard to flip the narrative in my brain, just because I want to try to like build a better relationship with Psalms than I currently have. And I think like I started to pull out this, like, it goes back to experience. And I started to look at like the way we experience God and like pulling that from this text instead, of like talking to God, calling out his name, looking to him in times of need, but like in that sense that like, he's not going to fix every single problem, but like having a friend to talk to in those moments. And so I started trying to like flip that in my head of like, verse 6, the suffering person cried out, the Lord listened and saved him from every trouble. Like, while my brain went to that negative like action of like, but can he actually do that? Like, part of the human experience is those like negative experiences. That's just a part of who we are. But you can talk to God in those moments and like lean on God and like have that conversation for that support. And so I don't know. I just was trying to flip the narrative so hard of like, so I think with this one, I pulled out more, or I tried to pull out more of that like encouragement of like just experiencing God as God is in your life, and trying to see that goodness, which sometimes can be really hard for some people when, depending on what's going on in your life. But yeah, that's it.
That's so interesting, because I'm like rereading, because I like to read as people are talking, and like this one, how do I say this? There's a lot going on in my life, in the world, in everything. There's a lot going on in the nation. There's a lot going on. And so it's interesting, you like seeing the bad and finding the good in it. Because I read this, and there are some things in here that I kind of disagree with, but I do like, my brain immediately goes to the good. And I think it, like, especially, so my title I don't know in most translations, but mine says praise for deliverance from trouble. And I think it's sometimes easier in some hardships to imagine the good than it is to imagine the bad. And so like, especially with all the things that are going on just in my life right now, reading this, I was like, no, I do go straight to the good. This is the first psalm where I'm like, wow, I'm feeling great about this. Like, I circled as you were talking, 18, the Lord is near to the brokenhearted. That's awesome. I love that. And that, I don't know, this is the first psalm that I don't really have nothing immediately took me by surprise and made me wrestle with. It just did feel like a deliverance from trouble to me. So that's interesting that we both took that in a very different way.
I don't think I feel any particular way about the song, to be honest. I think that maybe it's like, words. I feel like I look at all Psalms in the context of all Psalms. Like, I don't see Psalms, even the ones that are positive, as like, this is how you should be. The ones where, he's upset, that's bad. good, bad. I feel like I've, at least with time, like, approached Psalms almost as very, like, morally neutral, with kind of like a neutrality that, like, this is just like a human experience. This is an attempt. This is a practice. This is a grief. This is a celebration. And I am pretty passionate about approaching a lot of things with like a moral neutrality, because I think it can be really helpful when it comes to like undoing shame. And that it's like it's not about shoulds or oughts, or I should be acting this way, I ought to be doing this. But it's about like what aligns with your values. How do you feel right now? You know what I mean? And so I guess, yeah, as I'm reading this psalm, I'm like, yeah, like it's beautiful. And I think it reminds me of the times in my life when I've felt really rooted in gratitude, And I think in times of suffering, in times where there's a lot of chaos, are sometimes the most important times to like return to gratitude, because or else you're gonna like lose your um foundation, your grounding. Um but that's not always how we feel. We don't always feel grateful, and I don't think that's necessarily bad. I think that's just human. So I think I understand like where both of you are coming from.
So, interestingly, in a change of events, I kind of agree with Allison about disliking stuff. And I, like Salmon said, like I agree with both of y'all as well, but yeah, I think it's really, well, I don't know. I guess I see both sides, but it's hard for me to like really enjoy the lament or the like Psalms of praise. And I wonder if that has to do with me. Like I wonder, Sam, like what your mom would have to say about my thoughts with the Psalms. And if it's like how I feel about like positive or like uplifting versus like down putting emotions. But yeah, I think it's hard. First off, Allison, what translation did you use for yours?
I'm a common English Bible girly. I use it for
Okay.
everything.
Yeah. So I think too, like it's interesting here seeing the difference in translations, because yours was talking about like the person who does this is gonna blah 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 blah. Um, but then mine, so I usually use the NRSV for Psalms, but this was the NRSV UE, and it's more like personalized. Like it feels like this person is singing it themselves versus like yours seems like someone is like saying it about a person. So even like verse 6, this poor soul cried and was heard by the Lord and was saved from every trouble. And like that's very different from like when he like I don't know. Or like verse 5, look to him and be radiant, so your faces shall never be ashamed. Like that's more of like an advice than like a
That's my
like,
translation. That's interesting.
yeah. Yeah. And so having like just a difference in perspective, I think can like completely shift our understanding of the text. But also it made me think a lot about like how easy it is to I called myself out earlier because I was thinking about how easy it is to like pick apart like every single person's actions, especially myself, about like, well, I did this one thing wrong, or like I said this one thing wrong. Instead, like when you mentioned like to just like take the Psalms as the Psalms, um, and like it's just a part of humanity and like lived experience. Like as much as I love like individual songs here, especially Psalm 22, if you haven't heard, but having each of these like being like a song for the moment, like am I always gonna scream good luck babe maybe not, I mean, most likely, yeah, but like not all the time, you know? Or like if I'm gonna like scream react to a certain song, like it can't always be applicable. And every single lyric in that can't always be the right lyric. And so I think like picking apart each verse is just not fair. And I do it. Like if I see a verse in the Bible, I'm like, I don't like that one. I don't know how I feel about that one, which just feels kind of unfair. So, yeah, Psalms are rough. And it's usually why I like them, but yeah, it's hard to like stay joyful, I think. For this long, to stay joyful for this many verses, like what?
Who would have thought we saw the day where Sam Williams is the one defending the Psalms? Look how much I've turned around. We're going to keep going and go to our last one, our gospel reading, which today is Mark 10, 46 to 52. So we've been in Mark 10 for a while, and I keep saying very similar things about Mark 10 because Mark 10, I feel like at this point I could sum up in like a couple sentences. It's like Jesus is doing healing and miracles and things and telling the disciples, here's who I am, and here's what's going to happen. And the disciples are like, I don't understand. And they keep trying to say something, and he's like, you have no idea what's happening. You don't get it. I'm not of this power structure. I want to rechange it. But we get to 10, 46 through 52, which is the healing of Bartimaeus, who is a blind man living on the street. And I, like, Allison, you said it as a joke, and we're embarrassed about it. I always read my text the day of. And so it's been a really busy week. So I set aside, I was like, I'm going to give myself like 2 hours today. And I really want to have a quiet moment to sit with the text. And I sat with this text and was like, this is boring. This specific text, 46 through 52, I read it, 6 verses. And I was like, this is simple. Bartimaeus walks up. He's like, Jesus, hey, it's me, I'm Bartimaeus. And Jesus heals him. And I was like, that's it. I read it like 3 times. And that's all I got from it. So because I had blocked out so much time, I just kept reading Mark because I like Mark a lot. And actually, I told her I was going to shout her out, even though she hates when I do this on the podcast. But I am going to shout out my mom, who we said earlier, because I was on FaceTime with her talking about something else. And I was like, yeah, I'm about to do our recording episode. I have Bartimaeus. This one's boring. And she was like, you didn't actually read it. And I was like, no, I read it like 4 times. She was like, I don't think you did. And we had like a conversation about it where she was like, reread it and reread it as a transition to Jerusalem. And I had no idea what that meant. So I did it again. And I even read it out loud at one point. And she was like, do you understand? Are you starting to get it? Because I had just read through almost all of Mark. I got to the crucifixion of Jesus, just rereading. And when you read it in that context of a transition to the rest of it, a transition to Jerusalem, it really is a different text. Because Jesus, this whole time, like I said, in Mark 10, is going through this kind of argument with the disciples where they don't fully understand what it means that he's divine. They keep trying to question it. Some of them see him get transfigured. They don't understand it. And Jesus keeps saying, like, don't talk about it, which we've talked about in this podcast before. I always say is because, like, you don't fully know what you're talking about. Stop talking. And so they get from that point in the ministry to they're about to go into Jerusalem. And once Jerusalem happens, once Palm Sunday happens, it is a fast train ride to what's going to happen. He enters a very political world where he is seen as dangerous, he is seen as a radical, and as soon as he walks in the door, people are going to plot and try to kill him. And there's that knowledge beforehand. So then what is the Bartimaeus text? And the Bartimaeus text, if we look at it as a transition, Bartimaeus is one of the most faithful people in Mark. Because Bartimaeus is the one who is physically blind, and yet he is the one who knows the identity of Jesus more than anyone else. Because what's going on through the rest of the Jerusalem story is people trying to trick Jesus and not understanding, and him giving them just a little glimpse, and people around the city realizing that he is the prophet, he is the Messiah. And Bartimaeus gets it immediately. Bartimaeus, without being able to see, just by hearing that Jesus is there, walks up, is persistent, knows he is the Messiah, and asks for what he needs. And after hearing it from that angle and then reading my commentaries, a lot of the commentaries say the same thing of he does everything that a faithful person is supposed to do. He immediately tries to get to Jesus. He tries to give away everything. There's a detail in it where he throws away his cloak, which when I in my first 3 readings, I was like, okay, he's just really excited. But they were talking about if a man who's living on the street throws away his possessions, he knows something's about to happen. He knows that what he is asking for is about to come to fruition. And so he has that trust in God. And so if you see it as that, as Bartimaeus is the transition from the disciples not getting it to the rest of Jerusalem slowly realizing that Jesus is the Messiah. He is the linchpin. He is the person who immediately knows it. Just instinctually, just by faith, he knows it. And so I have to give a shout out to my mom for telling me to reread it. And I do like this text a lot more now because I think it's so easy. It almost feels like a metaphor of like how I read it. It feels too symbolic of like this blind man on the street who I just like ignored the text and kept going. Like it feels almost too, but that's what this is. It's so easy to move past this, but it sets up the rest of the story. So that's it. I want to hear what you guys think.
I don't have a whole lot to add, Sam. I think that was like a really amazing interpretation and storytelling. Honestly, really good storytelling. I was like, yeah, what? Okay. But yeah, I think this is one of those stories where I'm just gonna kind of sit with like, what does it mean to be faithful? What does it mean to learn from this blind man? What does it mean to recognize Jesus instinctually? And going beyond that, into our lives, what does it look like for us to recognize love and recognize Holy Spirit and recognize Jesus in the world now, like instinctually, right? To be so aligned, to be so like immersed that it's like you can have that kind of like faith and you can like trust and follow that faith. And then also I think a lot about the way we posture ourselves to receive things, to receive gifts, to receive blessings, to receive whatever it is that we hope for, This is something I feel like I'm constantly learning from faithful people in the Bible, and something I'm learning from my friends who, aren't really religious, but really believe in the concept of manifesting. That's not my personal journey, but like the idea that it's not actually about the supernatural, it's about your positioning, right? How are you posturing yourself? How are you leaning towards that thing, in this thing being Jesus, right? How are you leaning towards the miracle? I don't know, just something to think about.
Yeah. Again, like I don't feel like I have too much to add, but Sam, I feel like I needed to hear like a solid like 20, maybe 25-minute sermon on that. Like that was, for context, if anybody listening is not familiar with the UMC structure, like it's most common that you'll get like a solid like 15-minute sermon, maybe 20 if it's a really in their topic. I'm known for giving half-hour sermons, and I apologize to any of my future congregations for like them sitting being hungry. But Sam, I needed to hear you more. Like I just need to hear you talk about this more. And like what struck me the most, I think, was when you mentioned how like not just that he like threw off his cloak, because my translation says he threw off his cloak. So I hadn't even thought about it in the context of like throwing away his coat or his cloak. And so like in my mind, I was like, okay, does this have to do with like nakedness and vulnerability? Which could also be a thing. But what you brought up, thinking about like not just that he threw out his like like a really arguably necessary possession for him, but that he like already knew that he was going to be fine, and that like that Jesus had what he needed. Yeah, that's just really meaningful, and for him to like be able to identify Jesus like that, and to just like know and trust that like I could imagine the blind man like reciting the psalm to himself, if that makes sense. Yeah, and I'm glad that your mother invited you to read this over again with more context, because like I also thought it was a little boring, and it's not one of the standout passages that we like grow up with, or that I grew up with. So it's nice to like spend time with it and like get to know it more intimately.
One of the commentary I read that gave me a lot of that, like how faithful he is, that was their title, is like, he's the most faithful person in Mark, and yet we ignore this text because it's not as fun. And I was like, wow, I really got called out. They knew.
Yeah, I mean, shout out to both you, Sam, and your mom, because I definitely had the same like initial reaction as you. I read this text and I was like, Jesus healed the blind, cool, knew that. Like, it literally was like, nice, fascinating. But I think like, I mean, I was going to say pretty much the same things that Sydney and Grace were going to say, but I think it's interesting to like look at it in that context, especially like with the transition stuff you were talking about. And I think there's this like, you know, off of what Sydney was saying, like focusing on, gosh, that like, I don't know. I just think there's something about just the blind faith there of like, I don't know. I'm not adding anything to this because everybody's like, I think you've left us all sitting in this period of like, we just need to think about it and contemplate it and like look at it in this lens that you've now presented to us, I think.
Whoops. Well, anyways, that's the end of our episode. It's such a weird one for me to leave off on. I didn't mean to leave you all with nothing for it, but this episode was really nice. And this episode, we talked about a lot of things in a big context that I can at least speak personally meant a lot to things going on in my little small context. So, like, it was a good episode. I like this episode. I like most episodes here. So, Sydney, with that, do you want to take us away in a closing prayer?
Yeah, let's pray. God, thank you so much for this time. Thank you for each of these wonderful, beautiful people that I got to share this space with. I pray that we would go from today refreshed, energized, or not, or taking a nap. But regardless, meditating on what we have shared and the ways that we have been vulnerable in the space, and that we would learn from each other, and that we would grow from that. And yes, in your precious name, amen.
I didn't hear an amen at first. I just assumed that there was an amen, and then everybody was looking up. So thank you guys for being with us. Thank you all for being guests on this episode, but also thank you guys for listening. There's nothing much to end on. So with that, we're all just going to say bye, guys.